The mansion gleamed like a jewel embedded in the city's hills, its halls filled with powerful men and stunning women who exuded wealth and influence. This was no ordinary party. It was the domain of Domenico Santoro, a man whose mere mention made even the bravest tremble. At 35, he ruled the most feared underworld empire with an iron fist and a heart of stone. His reputation was built on absolute loyalty, ruthless deals, and a coldness that froze any attempt at emotional closeness. Among the guests celebrating yet another of Domenico's victories over rival territories, Valentina Rossi moved like an elegant ghost, serving expensive drinks on silver trays. Her black and white uniform was armor that rendered her nearly invisible to those flaunting their illicit riches. But Valentina knew this world of opulence well. Just 2 years earlier, she would have been one of the guests, wearing haute couture and laughing carelessly. Her family had been prosperous until her father, a respected businessman, was ruined by debts owed to the wrong people. The financial collapse was so devastating, it killed her father from grief, left her mother gravely ill, and left Valentina alone to bear the weight of an unpayable debt. Every cent she earned in that humiliating job went toward the exorbitant medicines keeping her mother alive and slowly chipping away at the debt that loomed over them like a guillotine ready to fall. No one at that extravagant party knew the silent young woman refilling their glasses had been educated in the finest schools, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had an exceptional talent for numbers and business strategy, a legacy from a father who had prepared her to lead, not to serve. Her honey-colored eyes, darkened by sorrow, scanned the room until they landed on him. Domenico Santoro was impossible to ignore. Tall, over 6 feet, he dominated any space he occupied. His broad shoulders filled a tailored Italian suit that likely cost more than she'd earn in 5 years. His jet-black hair was impeccably styled, revealing a broad forehead and features that seemed carved from Italian marble. His eyes were deep and dark as bottomless wells, capable of reading lies on others' faces with unsettling precision. Faint scars on his hands told stories of violence he never needed to verbalize. Domenico had no true allies, only subordinates loyal out of fear or self-interest. He had no publicly acknowledged family, just a complex web of operations spanning the city and beyond. And on that particular night, he was accompanied by Claudia Ventura, a spectacularly beautiful woman whose personality was as hollow as her tight red dress. She clung to his arm like an expensive accessory, laughing loudly at things that weren't funny, desperate to hold the attention of a man who clearly didn't care about her presence. Valentina felt a bitter pang rise in her throat. It wasn't envy of their wealth. She had known that world inside out. It was disgust at their arrogance, at how Domenico and his inner circle seemed to believe they were gods among mortals, untouchable and superior. She saw the way he smiled, a cynical, calculated smile that never reached his eyes, as he accepted praise from men who trembled in his presence, knowing a single wrong word could have dire consequences. The small orchestra hired for the event began to play, and the haunting notes of an Argentine tango filled the air thick with tension and expensive perfumes. The melody was melancholic, brimming with repressed passion and impending tragedy. It was her father's favorite music. He used to say tango wasn't just a dance, but a dialogue of souls, a silent battle where 2 bodies conversed in a language beyond words. He had taught her every step, every turn, every dramatic pause in the golden afternoons of her privileged childhood, when she still believed the world was fair and predictable. A stubborn tear threatened to escape, but Valentina forced it back, swallowing it along with her pain. Crying was a luxury she simply couldn't afford. Tears didn't pay debts, didn't buy medicine, didn't bring her father back or heal her mother. She needed to be strong, invisible, to survive one more day in that elegant hell. Taking a deep breath to regain her composure, she headed toward the kitchen for more imported champagne, passing dangerously close to Domenico's group. That's when Claudia's voice, sharp and cruel as broken glass, reached her ears with crystal clarity. The woman was deliberately speaking loud enough to be heard. "Domenico, darling, look at the people you hire for such an exclusive event. That one," she said, pointing discreetly but intentionally at Valentina, "looks like a displaced peasant. I'm afraid she'll spill expensive champagne on my designer dress. You really should be more selective about who you let mingle with your important guests. It's almost embarrassing." The laughter that followed was cruel, echoing through the group like a pack of hyenas attacking wounded prey. Valentina stopped abruptly, feeling every pair of eyes burning into her skin like live coals. Her heart pounded erratically, a volatile mix of humiliation and fury beginning to boil in her veins. She could simply keep walking, ignore the public insult, pretend she hadn't heard. It's what anyone in her position would do. It was the expected behavior of someone who desperately needed that job to survive. But Valentina was not just anyone. She was the daughter of Antonio Rossi, a man who taught her that dignity was worth more than gold, that self-respect was the only treasure no one could steal. Even financially ruined, even on his deathbed, her father never lost his integrity. And in that crucial moment, with the tango music echoing in her ears and her father's memory warming her heart, something inside Valentina snapped. Domenico, to everyone's surprise, including Valentina's, didn't laugh at Claudia's malicious jab. His dark, impenetrable eyes met hers for a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity. She saw something there, not compassion exactly, because men like Domenico Santoro didn't know pity, but a cold, analytical curiosity, as if she were a complex puzzle he was trying to solve, an equation that didn't add up with conventional methods. He didn't defend her, didn't reprimand Claudia for her gratuitous cruelty, but he didn't endorse the public humiliation either. He simply watched, impassive as a marble statue, his face revealing nothing of what he thought or felt. And it was precisely that calculated indifference that hurt more deeply than any direct insult could have. Claudia's explicit cruelty was predictable, almost expected from someone so shallow, but Domenico's icy silence was a sophisticated form of complicity. The tango music swelled in volume and intensity, filling the vast room with its dramatic, melancholic passion. And in that precise moment, catalyzed by the humiliation, the devastating longing for her father, and the rage built up over 2 years of silent suffering, an absolutely insane idea was born in Valentina's mind. It was an idea born of grief, hopelessness, and a final spark of rebellion that refused to be fully extinguished. A flame of defiance ignited in her honey-colored eyes, replacing sorrow with fierce determination. She turned deliberately, no longer a shadow trying to fade into the walls, but a presence demanding attention. She placed the silver tray she carried on a nearby table with a firm, controlled motion that produced a loud metallic clink, enough to draw even more curious glances. The murmur of conversations gradually died like waves receding on a shore. Every eye, including Domenico's impenetrable black ones, was now fixed on her with unsettling intensity. Claudia scrutinized her from head to toe with a scornful smile painted on her blood-red lips. "Lost something, sweetie? Your place is in the kitchen with the other servants, not here among important people." Valentina ignored her completely, as if the woman were less significant than the air. Her eyes remained locked on Domenico's with an intensity that surprised even herself. The orchestra kept playing, and it seemed the music existed only for that moment, only for the two of them. "Mr. Santoro," she said, and her voice emerged clear, steady, and without the slightest tremor of hesitation. "I overheard your guest's conversation. It seems you and those in your circle believe people like me lack class, talent, or soul, that we're less human, less deserving of basic respect." A shocked, heavy silence like lead settled over the entire room. People around them began to inch closer subtly, sensing the unmistakable scent of a dramatic confrontation about to unfold. Claudia was visibly livid, her face twisted into a mask of fury and disbelief. "How dare you speak like that? Domenico, demand this insolent girl be removed immediately. Call your men." But Domenico merely raised a hand in a subtle, yet authoritative gesture that silenced Claudia instantly. His gaze never left Valentina, and now there was a dangerous, fascinated glint in those dark eyes that terrified his enemies. There was a spark of genuine interest, something he likely hadn't felt in years. "And what exactly do you propose?" he asked, his tone bordering on controlled mockery, but with an undercurrent of real curiosity. "I propose a bet," Valentina replied, and a small, defiant smile appeared on her lips, surprising her with her own audacity. The mockery on Domenico's lips transformed into something closer to a genuine, albeit dark and dangerous smile. He leaned slightly forward, like a predator assessing an unexpectedly interesting prey. "A bet. And what exactly could a simple maid wager with someone like me? Your week's tip? Your miserable job?" The group around them laughed, but the laughter died quickly when they realized Valentina showed not a hint of fear or intimidation. "I wager my dignity and my honor," she said, her voice echoing in the dense fog of silence that had settled. "If I can dance this tango now with you, here, in front of everyone, and prove I have more passion, more soul, and more truth in my movements than anyone in this room, including your companion, then you will have to publicly admit, in front of every person here, that you were wrong in your cruel and superficial judgment." Domenico laughed, a short, dry laugh completely devoid of real humor. "You want to dance tango with me?" he said, as if the idea were simultaneously absurd and remotely amusing. He glanced at her simple black work shoes, clearly unsuitable for dancing. You probably barely know the basic steps. This will be an embarrassing disaster for you. That's when Claudia, seeing a perfect opportunity to publicly and definitively humiliate Valentina, whispered something in Domenico's ear with a malicious smile. He listened intently, and the smile on his face grew crueler, sharper, more dangerous. He straightened, assuming the posture of a supreme judge about to deliver a sentence. Very well, I accept your little bet, he said loudly and clearly so absolutely everyone could hear every word. But bets need real consequences on both sides to be interesting. He paused dramatically, his eyes scanning Valentina from head to toe in a deliberately slow manner. If you dance here and now in a way that genuinely impresses me, in a way that touches something in me, I'll do far more than just admit I was wrong. He smiled, and it was a wolf's smile. I'll marry you. A collective gasp swept through the room like an icy wind. The proposal was so grandiose, so absurdly impossible, that everyone immediately understood the underlying message. Domenico wasn't offering an opportunity. He was setting up an elaborate stage for the most complete and devastating humiliation possible. He was putting Valentina in her place so publicly and definitively that she would never dare lift her eyes in the presence of powerful people again. It would be a cruel lesson everyone present would remember for years. Claudia smiled triumphantly, her eyes gleaming with anticipated malice. It was perfect. The poor maid would make a complete fool of herself on the dance floor, stumbling and humiliating herself, and then Domenico would dismiss her with a cutting joke that everyone would repeat for months. Domenico's power would be reaffirmed, the natural order restored. But to the profound shock of absolutely everyone present, especially Domenico Santoro, Valentina didn't flinch an inch. There was no fear in her eyes, only fierce, unwavering determination that burned like fire. Fear had been consumed, replaced by controlled, cold fury. She knew perfectly well he expected her to run, expected her to shrink before the prospect of public humiliation. But he had touched something deeply sacred to her, the tango, the living, pulsing memory of her father. I accept your proposal, she said, and her voice rang like the crystal-clear chime of a bell in a silent cathedral. But when I win, and I will win, I don't want your pompous surname or access to your illicit fortune. I want something far more valuable to me. I want you to fully pay off every cent of my family's debt, including accrued interest. And I want you to fully fund my mother's medical treatment until her complete recovery, with no cost limitations, in the best hospitals available, with the best specialists money can buy. For the first time that entire night, Domenico Santoro's carefully constructed mask visibly cracked. He stared at her with genuine surprise, and something more complex flickered behind his dark eyes. This wasn't an arrogant young woman seeking attention or an opportunist trying to gain leverage. There was a depth of purpose, a hopelessness transformed into courage that he hadn't anticipated. But it was too late to back down without appearing weak before his subordinates and allies. He was trapped in his own trap of arrogance. As you wish, he said, his voice a little tenser than moments before. Prepare for the greatest failure of your life. He extended his hand to her, a gesture both formal and clearly mocking. Valentina walked toward him with measured, confident steps, her upright posture revealing the refined upbringing her origins had given her. The orchestra, perfectly sensing the dramatic tension permeating the air, stopped the soft music they had been playing. The conductor, confused and nervous, looked to Domenico for guidance. With an imperious nod, Domenico ordered, "Play la comparsita, and play it with all the intensity you have. I want to feel every note." The opening chords of the most dramatic and world-famous tango began to echo through the vast room. The sound was a liquid promise of devastating passion, inevitable confrontation, and imminent tragedy. It was music that demanded everything from those who danced it. Valentina placed her delicate hand in his, and the electric current that passed between them was instant, shocking, and completely unexpected for both. Domenico's hand was large, warm, calloused from years of violence, but surprisingly gentle as it enveloped hers. His other hand settled on her back with a firm, possessive touch that made her involuntarily catch her breath. For a fleeting moment, the outside world with all its avid onlookers simply vanished. There was only the pulsing music, the unsettling warmth of his touch, and the challenge blazing intensely in their eyes. Domenico secretly expected her to be stiff, clumsy, inexperienced. He was already mentally planning to lead her through a few basic, inelegant circles, cruelly exposing her lack of real skill before dismissing her with a cutting joke everyone would repeat for months. But when he initiated the first step with absolute confidence, she followed not as a submissive partner, but as a true and equal one. Their bodies moved in perfect sync, as if they had rehearsed together for years. Valentina briefly closed her eyes, allowing herself to channel every precious memory of her father, every patient lesson, every shared laugh, every moment of happiness that seemed to belong to a completely different life. She wasn't dancing for Domenico Santoro or to impress the cruel onlookers. She was dancing for her father's sacred memory, for her mother's fragile life, for her own soul that refused to be crushed. The first turn was absolutely fluid, technically perfect, and emotionally devastating. The surprise on Domenico's normally impassive face was subtle, but Valentina felt it clearly in the slightly altered pressure of his hand. He tested with a considerably more complex step, a sharp, challenging cortado, and she not only executed the move with technical precision, but added a flourish entirely her own, a subtle yet incredibly proud head movement that left him momentarily breathless and completely disconcerted. The calculated mockery that permanently inhabited Domenico's eyes began to melt like ice under a scorching sun, gradually replaced by genuine astonishment he hadn't experienced in countless years. Who the hell was this extraordinary woman? How did a simple maid master tango with technique rivaling professional dancers? The entire room was immersed in absolute religious silence. The guests who had eagerly anticipated a comedic embarrassment were now witnessing something entirely different, a living, pulsing work of art unfolding before their incredulous eyes. Valentina wasn't just technically flawless in her execution. She danced with raw, visceral, and utterly overwhelming emotion that transcended mere technique. Every step told a complete story of deep longing, searing pain, justified anger, and stubborn hope. It was all there, exposed and vulnerable in every graceful twist of her body, in every intense, challenging glance she threw directly into his dark eyes. She was no longer the invisible, silent maid. He was no longer the all-powerful, terrifying boss. On that improvised dance floor, with the entire criminal elite watching hypnotized, they had become perfect equals. Two warriors in honorable combat, two lovers in passionate dialogue, two souls in a feverish conversation that completely transcended words or logic. Domenico's initial lead, which began arrogant and domineering as was his nature, began to fundamentally transform. He gradually stopped trying to subdue her through force or superior technique and began genuinely responding to her movements. The dance organically evolved from a one-sided display of power into a true balanced duet. He spun her with controlled force, and instead of appearing fragile or submissive, she seemed to literally fly before landing back in his arms, visibly stronger and more confident than before. Their legs intertwined in a technically precise and intensely sensual hook, and the intimate physical contact, so charged with palpable electricity it practically sparked, made Domenico's heartbeat completely out of rhythm. He could clearly feel the heat of her body through the thin fabric of her uniform, the soft, subtle scent of lavender in her dark hair, her hot, panting breath near his face. He became completely lost in those honey-colored eyes. Eyes that had once seemed dulled by resignation, now burned with an inner fire that threatened to consume everything in its path, including his carefully constructed defenses. The impenetrable ice mask Domenico had worn religiously for so many years began to crack deeply, and beneath it, a man he had deliberately forgotten and buried began to painfully awaken. The music reached its dramatic, emotional climax, powerful and devastating. On an impulse he genuinely didn't understand or control, Domenico dramatically dipped her backward in an absolutely breathtaking finale. Her body hovered over hers at an impossible angle, their faces separated by mere inches, charged with tension. His hands, which moments earlier had indifferently held an expensive whiskey glass with supreme indifference, now held this extraordinary woman as if she were the most precious and fragile thing in the entire universe. Her breath mingled with his in the charged air between them, and her scent intoxicated him more powerfully than any drink ever could. It was an intoxicating mix of honest work, undeniable femininity, and pure courage. He felt her heart pounding wildly and uncontrollably against the palm of his hand, or perhaps it was his own heart that had completely forgotten how to beat normally. For a long, tense moment, loaded with dangerous possibilities, he desperately wanted to kiss her. He wanted to kiss this incredibly insolent maid right there, in front of the entire underworld elite, in front of a furious Claudia, and to hell with all the social and political consequences. The desire was so intense, so primal and uncontrollable, that it genuinely frightened him to his core. The final dramatic note of the music lingered in the heavy air like smoke, and then slowly died, leaving behind a deep, heavy silence laden with unnameable emotions. For several seconds that felt like hours. Absolutely no one moved. The entire room seemed to be collectively holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, Very slowly and with visible reluctance, Domenico carefully brought her back to an upright, safe position. But he didn't release her immediately as he should have. His hands remained firmly positioned on her, and his eyes stayed completely locked on hers, searching intensely, desperately trying to decipher the impossible enigma she represented to his ordered world. The hypnotic spell was finally broken by an unexpected sound, a solitary, courageous clap, quickly followed by another and another, until the entire room erupted in a thunderous, prolonged ovation. People weren't just applauding a technically impressive dance performance. They were applauding and celebrating the extraordinary courage, undeniable talent, and pure, devastating emotion they had witnessed. It was something that penetrated even the hardened hearts of those dangerous men and calculating women. Valentina finally broke the intense gaze, feeling a hot blush rising inexorably to her cheeks as she fully realized the magnitude of what she had just done. The adrenaline that had sustained her courage finally began to wane, giving way to an uncontrollable tremor that coursed through her entire body. She deliberately stepped away from Domenico, immediately feeling an inexplicable, unsettling loss as she left the warmth and safety of his strong arms. He watched her pull away, and for the first time in many years, he experienced something dangerously close to genuine loss. His dark eyes automatically swept the room and inevitably landed on Claudia, whose face was visibly twisted into an ugly mask of impotent fury, corrosive jealousy, and absolute disbelief. The sense of triumph he would normally feel at winning a bet simply wasn't there. Instead, he felt only a growing disgust for her obvious pettiness, for the moral emptiness she represented. His gaze inevitably returned to Valentina, who was now strategically positioned near the wall, desperately trying to become invisible again, but it was too late for that. Everyone in the room had truly seen her now. She had won decisively. The bet had been made publicly, and the result was undeniable to any honest observer. Domenico felt the weight of the promise he had made so arrogantly. "I'll marry you." The absurd words, spoken with such calculated disdain, now hung in the charged air like a sacred, irrefutable promise that couldn't simply be ignored or dismissed. But Valentina had cleverly changed the terms of the bet, asking for something entirely different: her mother's medical treatment and the payment of her family's debts. A powerful wave of respect, something Domenico Santoro rarely felt for anyone, overwhelmed him completely. She wanted nothing for herself, no personal gain or material advantage. With a brusque, authoritative nod to two of his most trusted men, he began to make his way determinedly through the crowd of guests, completely ignoring the insistent questions, extremely curious glances, and speculative whispers. He desperately needed to speak with her privately, urgently needed to understand who she really was behind that humble uniform. He found her strategically positioned in the discreet corridor leading to the back kitchen. She was leaning against the cold wall, eyes firmly closed, breathing deeply and deliberately, as if actively trying to recompose her mental and emotional sanity. "Valentina," he said, and her name sounded strangely intimate and surprisingly soft on his normally hard lips. He hadn't even known her full name until that exact moment. He'd had to discreetly ask one of the event organizers. She opened her eyes quickly, clearly surprised he had followed her. "Mr. Santoro, she began hesitantly, but the words simply failed. The man who ran million-dollar illicit operations and negotiated with extremely dangerous people with a single word was completely at a loss for words before an extraordinary young maid. "Your family's debt," he finally managed, his voice considerably huskier than usual. "Consider every cent paid in full, including accrued interest. Give me the full name of the clinic where your mother is and all relevant medical details. My people will handle everything tonight. She'll be transferred tomorrow to the best private hospital in the city and will have access to the most renowned medical specialists money can buy with no cost limitations." Valentina's eyes instantly filled with hot tears, but this time they were tears of profound relief and overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you so much," she whispered, her voice completely choked with emotion. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me," he said with defensive brusqueness, visibly uncomfortable with his own unexpected generosity. "It was a public bet, and I lost fair and square. That's all." He watched her intensely, studying the way she visibly struggled to contain her turbulent emotions, the extraordinary strength that radiated even in her obvious vulnerability. Curiosity consumed him completely like fire. "Where exactly did you learn to dance with such technical and emotional perfection?" "My father taught me personally," she answered, her voice still low and laden with longing. "He loved tango passionately. He considered it a supreme art form, the The mention of her deceased father immediately brought a visible shadow of deep sadness to her face, and Domenico felt a completely irrational, unsettling urge to erase that shadow of pain, to protect her from any future suffering. The ornate door to the ballroom swung open abruptly, and Claudia's irritatingly shrill voice echoed down the corridor. "Domenico, what exactly are you doing here alone with her? Absolutely everyone is talking and speculating. You humiliated her publicly as you promised. Now end this ridiculous theater." Domenico turned slowly to Claudia, and for the first time he truly saw her for what she was behind the superficial beauty. Spiritually small, consumed by corrosive envy, ugly inside in ways no expensive plastic surgery could ever fix. The physical beauty that had once superficially attracted him now seemed merely an empty, worthless shell. "Leave immediately, Claudia," he said, his voice cold as the Arctic. "Your presence is no longer wanted here or anywhere near me. The only person truly humiliated tonight was you and your repugnant pettiness." He turned back to Valentina, and his intimidating expression softened in an almost imperceptible but undeniable way. "You will no longer work as a maid on this property or anywhere else. Starting tomorrow morning, you will work directly and exclusively for me as my trusted personal assistant for confidential matters." Claudia and Valentina gasped simultaneously in absolute shock. "What?" they said in perfect, incredulous unison. "Have you completely lost your mind, Domenico?" Claudia shrieked, her voice rising several octaves. "She's absolutely nobody. What will important people say? What will your associates think?" "I don't care in the least what anyone says or thinks," he retorted with absolute firmness, his gaze remaining intensely fixed on Valentina. "She proved tonight that she has more genuine courage, more moral integrity, and more inner fire than anyone in this room, and those are precisely the qualities I value and want by my side." It was a completely impulsive, utterly illogical decision that went directly against everything he stood for and how he conducted his dangerous business. But something deep within him, something her dance had violently awakened from a long sleep, categorically refused to let her simply return to the shadows and disappear from his life. "Mr. Santoro, I really can't accept," Valentina began, completely stunned by the dramatic, unexpected turn of events. "I know absolutely nothing about being an assistant to someone in your position. You'll learn quickly," he interrupted with authority. "Your salary will be at least 10 times what you earn in this degrading job. You'll have access to all the resources needed to properly care for your mother and rebuild your life completely. The only non-negotiable condition is that you never hide in the shadows or pretend to be less than you truly are again. The extraordinary woman I witnessed on that dance floor wasn't born to serve others submissively. She was born to shine brightly." He stepped even closer to her, deliberately ignoring Claudia's nuclear fury vibrating in the air. He was so dangerously close that Valentina could clearly feel the radiant heat emanating from his muscular body. His voice dropped to a husky, intimate, and utterly dangerous whisper that only she could hear, a tone that sent shivers from her head to her toes. "And Valentina," he said, his hot breath teasing her sensitive ear, "that part about the marriage I proposed so arrogantly, it's definitely still open for future consideration." Without saying another word or offering any further explanation, he turned decisively and returned to the ballroom, leaving behind a Claudia completely livid with impotent rage and a Valentina in deep shock, her heart pounding so uncontrollably it seemed to want to escape her chest. The absurd but incredibly sensual promise of a dangerous man echoed persistently in her ears. The night that should have resulted in her complete ruin and public humiliation had inexplicably transformed into the beginning of something infinitely more complicated, more dangerous, and potentially more transformative than a simple tango could ever suggest. The following days unfolded like a surreal dream from which Valentina couldn't wake. The transition from invisible maid to trusted personal assistant to the most powerful and feared man in the underworld was as abrupt and disorienting as being yanked from a dark room and thrown directly under scorching spotlights. Domenico's luxurious penthouse, perched atop a skyscraper that literally dominated the entire city, was an alien world of cutting-edge technology, maximum security, and discreet but undeniably oppressive luxury. Valentina was installed in a guest room larger and infinitely more luxurious than the entire modest apartment where she had lived with her mother during the past 2 difficult years. But physical comfort didn't alleviate the constant tension permeating every moment. She was living under the same roof as Domenico Santoro, navigating a world of invisible dangers, questionable loyalties, and unwritten codes she didn't yet fully understand. Domenico maintained a studied professional distance during the day, treating her with an almost absurd formality, considering the intimacy of that dance. He personally trained her in his complex businesses: how to read dangerous people, how to spot subtle lies, how to manage extremely sensitive information that could mean death for the less careful. She quickly discovered she had a natural talent for strategy, analysis, and negotiation, skills inherited from a father who had been brilliant in business before his fall. But at night, when work finally ceased and the city outside transformed into a sea of twinkling lights, the tension between them became almost unbearable. Silent dinners where their gazes met across the table and lingered for seconds too charged. Moments when their hands accidentally touched reaching for the same document, and an electric current coursed through both. The way he watched her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, with an intensity that made her heart race uncontrollably. The situation grew drastically more complicated when Domenico's old alliances began to crumble. Rivals who saw him as weakened by his seemingly emotional, impulsive decision to elevate a former maid began testing his limits, subtly challenging his authority. There was a brutally thwarted assassination attempt, where Valentina witnessed for the first time the raw violence and lethality Domenico was capable of wielding to protect what was his. It was on that terrifying night, after the traitors had been eliminated with cold efficiency, that something finally broke between them. Domenico found Valentina trembling in her room, not from fear of him, but from fear for him, for the possibility of having lost him. "You could have been seriously hurt," she whispered, tears streaming freely. "You could have died, and I—" He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms with almost desperate force. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised against her hair. "Not now that I've finally found someone, worth more than my entire empire." When their lips finally met, it was as if the entire universe exploded into flames around them. The kiss wasn't gentle or hesitant. It was consuming, desperate, months of tension and repressed desire finally finding release. In the months that followed, as their relationship evolved from professional to intensely personal, Valentina gradually discovered the complex layers of the man behind the terrifying reputation. Domenico wasn't just a ruthless boss. He was a man who had built impossible walls around his heart after being brutally betrayed by those he should have trusted. A man who had never known true love or unconditional loyalty until she entered his life, dancing a tango that shattered all his defenses. The marriage proposal came not in an expensive restaurant or during an elaborate party, but in a quiet, intimate moment. They were on the penthouse rooftop watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and pink. Domenico turned to her, and for the first time, Valentina saw complete vulnerability in his normally impenetrable eyes. "Marry me, Valentina, not because of an absurd bet made months ago, but because I can't imagine my life without you. Because you made me believe that men like me can deserve true love too." She said yes, tears of happiness blurring her vision, knowing she was choosing a dangerous but true path. The wedding was discreet, held in an ancient chapel with only essential witnesses, but its meaning was profound. Valentina was no longer a maid or an assistant. She was the wife of the most powerful man in the underworld, a position that came with immense dangers, but also with a love she never imagined possible. Months later, when Valentina discovered she was expecting a child, she felt a complex mix of overwhelming joy and primal fear. Bringing a child into that dangerous world seemed both the most natural and most terrifying thing. When she told Domenico, pressing his large, calloused hand against her still flat belly, she saw something extraordinary happen. The man who faced deadly enemies without blinking wept openly. "A child," he whispered with absolute reverence. "Our family." The pregnancy transformed Domenico in ways his enemies could never imagine. He became even more protective, more determined to build a legacy beyond violence and fear. He began secretly legalizing parts of his empire, creating legitimate businesses his child could inherit without the stain of blood. Valentina, with her sharp strategic mind and unwavering moral integrity, became his true partner in this impossible transformation. When Antonio Domenico Santoro was born, with his father's dark hair and his mother's honey-colored eyes, it was as if the entire universe rearranged itself. Domenico held his son for the first time with hands that had caused so much destruction and made a silent promise. This child would grow up knowing love, knowing safety, knowing a father who would be better than the man he had been before an extraordinary dancer invaded his life. Valentina's mother, now fully recovered thanks to exceptional medical treatment, moved to a nearby property Domenico acquired specifically for her. The elderly woman who had witnessed her family's devastating fall and her daughter's heroic struggle now saw Valentina not just survive, but truly thrive. In quiet afternoons, as Domenico rocked Antonio and sang off-key lullabies, Valentina watched her impossible family and felt overwhelming gratitude. Years later, on a special night, They returned to the exact ballroom where it all began. Domenico had bought the entire property, transforming it into a cultural center offering free dance classes to underprivileged youth. It was his way of honoring the transformation a single tango had sparked in his life. On the empty dance floor, with the same dramatic music playing softly, Domenico extended his hand to his wife. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Santoro?" Valentina smiled, that smile that still made his heart race even after all those years. She placed her hand in his, and their bodies moved in perfect harmony, executing the same steps that had irreversibly changed both their lives. But now there was no challenge or confrontation. There was only deep love, mutual respect, and gratitude for the unlikely journey they had shared. "You know," Domenico said as he spun her gracefully, "I really thought I was offering an impossible bet that night. I thought I'd humiliate you and go on with my empty life." "And I," Valentina replied, "thought I was risking everything for my mother and my dignity. I never imagined I'd find true love and a family in the arms of the most dangerous man in the city." He pulled her closer, his lips brushing her forehead with tenderness. "You didn't just win a bet, Valentina. You conquered my soul, transformed my life, and gave me a reason to be a better man. Our son will grow up knowing love, not violence, knowing integrity, not betrayal. And it's all because of a courageous woman who dared to challenge a boss and dance like her life depended on it." As the music reached its emotional climax and he dipped her dramatically backward in that breathtaking finale that perfectly mirrored their transformative first night, Valentina looked into the eyes of the man she loved and saw not the feared Domenico Santoro of the underworld, but simply Domenico, her husband, the father of her child, her partner in every sense of the word. Their life wasn't perfect or free of challenges. Domenico's past occasionally resurfaced in dangerous ways that required constant vigilance, but they faced every obstacle together, as they had danced that first tango, in perfect sync, trusting each other completely. And when they finally kissed on that dance floor laden with powerful memories, with the city gleaming through the massive windows as a silent witness, they both knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the greatest loves and deepest transformations are born from the most unlikely challenges. A tango, an arrogant bet, a courageous woman, a dangerous man, and a love that defied all odds and expectations to flourish in the most unexpected place possible, proving that redemption, transformation, and second chances exist even for those the world had already judged and condemned. This is the story of how a dance changed everything, how courage met power, how love conquered darkness, how two unlikely souls found their way to each other through music, challenge, and an impossible promise that became the most beautiful reality either of them could have imagined.